Yo, what's up everybody? Welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week we're doing an episode called The Most Common Gameplay Mistakes Part 2. As that name implies, this is a sequel episode to an episode I recorded about a year ago. It's episode 67 if you want to check that out, where I compiled a list of common gameplay mistakes, common limited gameplay mistakes that I've noticed in places like my coaching sessions, or just going over gameplay logs that people post in Discord, or even just taking examples from gameplay, right? Mistakes I see my opponents making often, sometimes mistakes that I walk into myself. So today I've got an extension of that list. I've got about 10 or 15 more common gameplay mistakes that I put together. As I talk about these, I'm not only going to try to point out the mistakes, but also try to come up with some general solutions that you can kind of implement into your gameplay. I'll also point out that if you want some more focused gameplay content, I did a Baldur's Gate specific gameplay level up episode last week, and that was one of the more popular episodes I've done in a while. So if you want more of this, go check that out if you haven't. I recommend that. Also, one more thing before we jump in. If you are listening to this episode in podcast form and not watching it, these gameplay episodes tend to have a few pictures of game states, some screenshots, so apologies in advance if they're a little bit hard to visualize. I do try my best to spell them out. Usually it's not that big of a deal, but if you are more of a visual learner, you really want to see the screenshot in action. I post these episodes and every episode of Limited Level Ups almost on the Limited Level Ups YouTube channel with the visuals. I've got a PowerPoint going, so if you're more of a visual learner, check that out. There's a lot of other good content as well over there if you're not already subscribed. And of course, just before I jump in, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. If you like what we're doing here and you want to support the show, that is the number one place you can go. I want to give a big shout out to everybody who supports the show every week. Could not do it without you. Really does help the show keep going. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there you can check out. There's also some higher tiers over there. The coaching tier, of course. There's the gameplay and draft log video review tier where you can put your draft logs and your gameplay logs in one of the sections of the Discord. I'll give you like a 5 to 15 minute video breakdown of that draft or gameplay. I'll send that back to you, kind of like a mini coaching session. So a lot of great rewards over there if you choose to support the show. Really, once again, appreciate everybody's support. And yeah, let's just jump into the show. All right, so I want to start with a mistake that is pretty broad. It's kind of a big umbrella category of mistakes. And there's a lot of ways that you can approach this, but this is what I think makes the difference between a good player and a kind of whatever player. And the mistake here is failing to pay attention to the opponent's plays or failing to account for information that your opponent has given you. It's important to make sure that you're playing all of your cards in the way that makes sense, right? You're spending your mana as much as you can each turn. You're sequencing your spells properly. But that is truly only half the game, right? Like, that's spell sequencing, saving your removal for the right time, knowing when to press your advantage, like basically knowing when to do your own stuff, right? Focus on your own stuff. The thing is though, figuring out how to do that stuff properly at its core comes from understanding where your opponent stands in the game and deducing what their plan might be and deducing what their hand could look like. I think that at its core, I see Magic as a game with two key components. It's resource management, all the stuff I was just talking about, how to use your spells properly, how to spend your mana the most efficient way, when to use your life as a resource. And the other component is information management. And they go hand in hand, right? Like I was just saying, your resource management very much depends on the information you're getting from the game and how you actually want to use your cards. But every game action that your opponent takes gives you some information to work with. And, so it works the opposite way too. Every game action you take gives your opponent information. But I so often see people just ignoring this aspect of the game, right? I see people just playing their cards like it's a one-sided game. And now, getting to that second level of being able to not have to worry about your cards is certainly a skill, but it's something you should absolutely, as of today, try to pay attention to what your opponent is doing. And so the solution, of course, to this mistake is gather as much information as you can from your opponent's plays. I actually did a whole episode on this topic with Ethan, Lord Tupperware, a few weeks back if you want to deep dive on the topic. But really, if you just want the quick and dirty answer to how do I do this, it's you just keep asking yourself, why did my opponent do that? Whenever they take a game action, just say, why did they do that? And sometimes they're scripted, right? Sometimes just like, well, they played their 2-drop, obviously. But as you go on, as the game progresses, there's going to be more options for your opponent to make, and ones that are, face up on the table to you to some degree. And you can go, why did they make that play over this one? Why did they attack instead of choose to block? Every single thing, I want to highlight this. Every single thing the opponent does is with intention. And you can gain something from that, from understanding the intention. I think it's funny too, because, you always hear streamers talking about how Twitch chat has no idea what they're talking about. They're just a bunch of people just throwing out, a bunch of random game actions. And I think that, there's certainly a little bit of that. But part of it is when Twitch chat, or anybody who's just walking into a game, looking at a game, maybe might not give the best, most informed opinion of what somebody should do. It's because they don't have that context of the information that you've been gathering the entire game, right? When a streamer's playing a game, they've seen every single game action leading up to where they are. And they can know a little bit better what the opponent might have in their hand or their intentions in the game, based on that information, a little more than, random Twitch chatter just coming into a game and seeing it point blank, just seeing, a screenshot or a snapshot of what's happening here. So let's get into some examples. When your opponent casts a adventure spell, the spell side of an adventure spell, let's say it's the web shot from Ettercap, or destroy a target creature with flying for 3 mana. They cast that at the end of your turn. And then they go to their turn, and maybe they make an attack or something, they have 5 mana, and they don't play their Ettercap. That's huge. The alarm bells should be going off and you're going, oh, why didn't they do that? That's an obvious one. That's like okay, they clearly have intentions of doing something else. They might have a trick. They might have a removal spell that they want to hold up. But so often I see people not even considering that, or maybe just going out like, oh, that was weird. They didn't cast it, huh? Okay, well, I guess I'll move on with my turn, right? It means something, right? Don't just ignore it. Another super common one is just your opponent leaving up a specific mana. Maybe it's over the course of multiple turns. They keep leaving up exactly white for 4 turns. Or, they've manual tapped on Arena. They haven't left it up to the auto tapper. They don't want the auto tapper to mess them up, so they keep that planes up manually tapping. Number one, they could be bluffing you, of course, but my level 1 thinking is they've got Patriarch's Humiliation, or they've got the instant speed protection spell, the indestructible spell on the Blessed Hippogriff, right? It's that kind of stuff that comes up almost every game, really. And you really have to be paying attention to that kind of stuff. Another example is your opponent untaps a land with Clever Conjurer. Well, they wouldn't just choose to untap a land for no reason. Clearly, this means something. And I think, part of this is, it's not so much that people don't notice people didn't cast their Ettercap or left the white man up or, untap something with Clever Conjurer. I think a lot of players that are, medium to pretty good players, they'll notice that. But maybe they don't take the next step and say, well, what does that mean? Right? And that's really, really key. Because if you don't take that next step, then you're not using this tool that your opponent's giving you, and you get in every single game to the best that you possibly could be using it. As a player who is thinking about this, quite often in every single game, I'm thinking about the information I'm giving up. When I have to untap a land with my Clever Conjurer at sorcery speed, it just pains me because I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm leaking information here. They're gonna know, right? And sometimes my gut will even go, I don't want to make, a certain play because I know it's so obvious that this play is happening. But it is still the right play to do. It just means that, my opponent's going to know what's up. Even something passive, right? Your opponent has missed their 4th land drop. Here's a good example. They missed their 4th land drop, so you know that they have all spells in hand. And a lot of times I'll say this when I'm playing with somebody or I'm in a coaching session. This exact situation will come up. My opponent will miss their 4th land drop and they'll go, okay, they have all spells in hand. We know that. And they'll go, wait, how do you know? I'm like, well, they missed their 4th land drop. They're definitely not going to just, not play their 4th land. Sometimes this happens on turn 7, right? You can't guarantee that they didn't draw a land and just chose not to play it. But you're always going to play your 4th land, so you know it's all action. And then from there, you go, well, what do I want to do with that information? Well, if they're on all action, and maybe I look at my hand and I've got maybe 2 spells, 3 spells, that probably means that I want to be a little more aggressive than I might have normally. Because if I let the game go a little bit longer, I let them hit their 4th and 5th land drop, they're going to be on all action, and I'm going to be on all, nothings. I'm going to be all on lands for the most part, right? So maybe at that point I go, okay, I want to press my advantage. I don't want to give them enough time to be able to capitalize on all the cards in their hands. I want to take a little more of an aggressive line than I might usually. Okay, and let's jump into a few examples here. So I've got a game here that I played on stream a few days ago. I'm a red-black deck, kind of red-black grindy. My opponent's a green-white deck. They're on 3 life. I'm on 22 life. They've got a board of a 3/3, an Icewind Stalwart, a Hippogriff, a Scouting Hawk. I've got 2 Shambling Ghasts, a Meteor Golem, and a Sepulchre Ghoul. So they've got decent blocks. If I just attacked all, I would deal 1 damage, right? I've got a Grim Bounty in hand. They've got 4 cards in hand. And this is one of the most important things. So they've got a lot of cards in hand. And also to note that My opponent kind of hadn't been doing too much in the early game. I hadn't been doing too much either. I was able to chip in with a few 1/1s, but, I didn't have any heavy hitters, so I wasn't even able to, capitalize on the fact that my opponent wasn't doing anything. So I've got this removal spell in hand against green-white specifically, and I'm thinking, okay, well, the level 1 is I can just kill their 3/3, get in a good attack here, and I'm well on my way to killing my opponent here. They're gonna need something here to not die, basically. And I think a lot of people just take that information face up and just go, okay, use my removal spell, kill their 3/3 attack. I'll probably be in a good spot. But I'm thinking to myself, well, what are these cards in hand that my opponent could have been playing? And worth noting too, they had missed land drops, right? They weren't just playing lands for the entire game. They're at 6 lands here, and I think we're on turn 10 or something. So I'm almost sure that there's spells in hand. I'm in a very ahead position, and I think to myself, how does this game go wrong? And the game goes wrong if I just cast my Grim Bounty, and they've got a Blessed Hippogriff or a Dread Learner, right? They blank my Grim Bounty, I can't get in a good attack, and then they can play their giant thing, and they'll start to, play, more stuff. And maybe even they have combat tricks in hand, right? Where this attack on board, it looks okay, but if they have just like one combat trick to eat one of my creatures, I only get in 1 unblocked damage. I'm left with not much going on, and they're left with, a decent board still, and they've got those 4 cards in hand, those 4 spells, which might be more combat tricks. Again, it could be a Dread Learner or a Blessed Hippogriff. So basically, there's a lot of ways this turn can go really, really wrong for me. So what do I do? Well, I could just say, all right, well, let's just say, maybe they don't have anything. Maybe I just cast the Grim Bounty. But I don't think it's a good idea, because I'm sure that the things they have in hand are just spells that they're not creatures, because they would have just played them, right? Unless they're adventure creatures. So they have to be something along the lines of a removal spell or a combat trick or something. So instead of just casting my Grim Bounty, I just wait a bit. I wait until I can draw some more creatures, go a little bit wider, so that a single removal spell or a single protection spell or a combat trick doesn't punish me. I want to draw more creatures so I can go wide, and maybe even force them to tap low or tap down. And then when the coast is clear, use my Grim Bounty. Because this is an exact situation that I was just talking about, where if you weren't taking in that your opponent didn't do that much in the early game, and you just cancel your Grim Bounty, I think you're very likely to get gotten by something here. Either a protection spell or a combat trick where you kill their creature, they eat one of your creatures, and you're not in a good spot anymore. And of course, the way this game planned out was, I did see the rest of their hand. They did have a Dread Learner. They also had a Hippogriff. They kind of had it all. I didn't actually end up winning this game, but that's because I flooded out a little bit here. But if I just drawn, 2 more creatures or something, then I really would have been able to put myself in a spot where, yeah, I can then attack all and not have to get blown out when I cast my Grim Bounty. Moving into another example here, an offshoot of this, kind of like I was mentioning before, is just not considering what open mana could mean. I think, once again, a lot of players get to the point where it's like, well, it's turn 4. My opponent's got plains, island up. They could have a bunch of things. It's a lot of things, so I probably shouldn't even worry about thinking about it. It's not that many things. If you just look at the set, it's really about, 4 or 5 things that they could possibly want to cast in this spot. Maybe it's a hear something on watch. Maybe it's a draw spell, right? Contact other planes, which I think is unlikely because that card doesn't get played a lot. Maybe it's you're confronted by robbers. The 4 mana make 3 1/1 tokens. The subset of cards they could have is probably a lot smaller than you might think. And if you can just put those cards in your head, you can better plan for it. Now, I will say, this example I have in front of me here, again, my opponent's got 4 open mana, white, blue up. I've got a 2/1. It's turn 4. And this example here, I kind of know what my opponent could have because this was game 2. This is actually from the Arena Open. And I know they did have You're Confronted by Robbers. But even if I wasn't in a game 2 here, that would be on my radar here as, they didn't play anything else, and they actually haven't even played very much for at all this game. So what could they possibly have here? Well, it's probably not going to be a cheap spell. It's not going to be a Hear Something on Watch, because I imagine they might play a 2-drop plus Hear Something on Watch. And how many things cost 4 mana or an instant in this format? Really not that much. So, again, even if I hadn't seen the Robbers card in a previous game, it would definitely be on my radar. And again, now it's going, well, I've identified what they could have. What do I do about it? Well, I said to myself, well, I've got a 2-1 on the battlefield here. That's all I have. I don't think I want to attack into that. I don't want to give them value at this point. And I've got a Steadfast Unicorn in my hand. So I just go, okay, you know what? I don't attack. I play my other creatures instead of attacking here. And then at some point, this 2-1 is going to be better than a 2-1 because I have a Unicorn. I'm going to be able to make it a 3-2. they're not just going to be able to, eat it for a third of their card, right? And just by taking a moment to think, I just go, I'm in a much, much better position than I would have been if I just said, well, they've got 4 mana, it could be anything, and attacking. All right, the next mistake here, and this is a big one and one that's really easy to fix, playing your spells, like your combat tricks, into open mana. So I've got an example here from a coaching session I did. The opponent is a blue-green deck. They've got 3 lands untapped. They've got a 2/2 and a 1/4. We're an Esper deck. We've got a 2/2 on the battlefield, and we are casting a Valiant Farewell into open mana, which is the 2 mana, your creature gets +2/+0, and then when it dies, you draw a card, then you get a boon with your next creature gets +2/+0. Now, they didn't really need to cast it in this situation, the Valiant Farewell, but they did, just because they kind of wanted to cycle it. This is leaving you open to such a blowout if they have any number of spells, right? They've got a bounce spell, they've got a band together. I was reviewing this, and immediately I stopped and went, oh, I probably wouldn't have done this, because if they have a band together, or, whatever it is, whatever interaction spell, you're in a really, really bad spot, because you just get 2 for 1 on the spot. You also have other spells in your hand you could play. You don't need to be taking this line when there's other good plays you can make. I think a lot of the times why this happens, or why players do this, why they feel like it's okay to cast their spells into open mana, is I think they maybe underestimate the likelihood that the opponent has something that can blow them out, right? And I don't know the exact numbers of like how likely it is that my blue-green opponent versus my black-white opponent, right, has an interaction spell, but I just know, I've played enough games of Magic to know that when they leave mana up on turn 3 and they've got a lot of cards in hand, it's just likely that one of those cards will be an interaction spell of some sort. And this mostly applies to the early game, right? I'm not saying after the dust is settled, on turn 5, after you've played your creatures, you shouldn't be casting stuff into open mana, because at some point, both players are going to have open mana because they just don't have spells to cast for at some point in the game. But earlier in the game, especially when your opponent hasn't had a chance to use an interaction spell just yet. So very easy. My very easy tip here is just don't play your combat tricks into your opponent's open mana in the early parts of the game. It's very likely they're going to have something. You always hear players be like, oh, of course they had it. They always have it. And it's like, well, yeah, they always have it when you give them an option. You give them an opportunity to have it and blow you out. If you just don't give them that opportunity, instead, just play out your other creatures and then use that spell later, you'll be in a much better spot so much more often. And this ties into a sub point I have here. A mistake is players misusing the phrase, make them have it. I'll make them have it, right? You kind of hear this from people where it's like, should I play around the trick? Should I not play around the trick? And it's like, all right, well, whatever. I'll just make them have it. And I think just like math is for blockers, right? That's kind of a joke phrase that kind of got misapplied, and I think people take that too literally these days. They literally just go, yeah, math is for blockers, I'll just attack all. When really, combat math is a very powerful thing, but that's another thing. Make them have it, I think it's used so often. So I'm going to go back to the number one, the thing I just talked about, the situation of playing your tricks into open mana early on. But even that situation I talked about a few minutes ago, where I was the black-red deck facing the green-white deck, when I could have cast my Grim Bounty, and I think it's very easy for me to just go, I'll just make them have it, right? It's not this, like, in-the-dark thing where I'm like, well, I gotta make them have it or else I'm playing scared. It's, you use the information that you've gathered throughout the game. The phrase, make them have it, really, like, how you should be using it is if you can't win the game otherwise, right? If you're in a position where it's like, well, if I just put that card in their hand, they're gonna win anyways, right? So I have to make them have it, because otherwise I can't win. If you're not in that position, and you can say, hey, I have other lines to win, just like I was saying in the red-black game, where I could just draw some more creatures and go wide, then do that. Making them have it in spots where they're very, very likely to have it is not a good idea. So once again, if they've been holding cards in hand, if you think they have tricks, if you think they have removal, it's not a good idea to make them have it, because you're going to lose that proposition so much of the time. I will say that if you think you're a player who's a bit too passive, right? Somebody who, just doesn't go for lethal when they can ever, right? You're just like, I gotta play it super, super safe. Maybe you can lean into make them have it a little bit more. But if you're the type of player who, you're a bit more brash about it, and you go, yeah, I'm always the one to cast the spell, cast my Grim Bounty, and I try to make them have it, consider dialing that back a little bit, right? It's finding that middle ground of going for it, pressing your advantage when you think you should, and holding back when it's very likely that they will have something that'll blow you out. Next mistake we've got is putting yourself in a position where you have to act first. So this is kind of related to what I was talking about, kind of related to what I was talking about last week about the whole don't blink first premise. But picture this situation, okay? So your opponent's got 3 open mana, Plains, Swamp, and they've got a vampire spawn. you've got a Rescuer Chwinga, it's a 2/2, and you've got an Armor of Shadows in your hand, and you say, well, I can attack into their vampire spawn, and I've got an Armor of Shadows, so if they choose to block, I can win that combat. But you have to be the one to act first, right? And you don't necessarily want to put yourself in that position. In general, in Magic, if you can put your opponent in the spot where they have to act first, that's a pretty powerful position, because then you can react in response, right? This is why the whole get ahead, stay ahead mentality is so effective, because if you can get on board early with creatures that are pressuring, and your opponent has to react to you, that's when you have all the power, and you can say, well, in response to you tapping 4 mana and trying to kill my creature, then I'll cast my Armor of Shadows. In this position here, yeah, you could win the combat against the spawn, but then your opponent, again, has open mana, and they can cast any number of spells to blow you out. So instead, just don't go for the combat. Don't go for the combat trick. Play out your other creatures, right? Play out your 3-drop. Play out your 2-drop, even if it means that, maybe you're not able to use all your mana that turn. Maybe you only have a 2-drop on turn 3, and you think, well, if I cast my Armor of Shadows here, I get to use all my mana. While it's really important to be mana efficient, making sure you don't get blown out, just get 2 for 1 on turn 3 is a little more important. And just like I was just alluding to, this isn't just in the first 2 turns of the game. As the game goes on, your opponent will accrue cards that they can use in response to things. And so will you, right? And this mostly applies to combats, I would say, where if you have to be the one to cast your spell first, and you'll only win the combat if you cast your spell first, then maybe consider just don't. Say, can I afford to lose my creature here if my opponent has a removal spell in response? Maybe it's kind of like a crappy creature, you don't care about it, but maybe it's a pretty good creature that you would really not like to use a combat trick on and then have your opponent kill it in response, right? I mentioned this last week too, but as the game goes on, like I said, you've kind of maybe drawn some instant speed removal spell, drawn some tricks, your opponent's likely to have done the same. I want to put my opponent in the position where they're the one that has to act first. They're the one that maybe I trick them into using their combat trick first, right? Where, they make kind of a suspect attack and I go, oh, great, this is a perfect situation. They attack with their 3/3 into my 4/4. I can now set up a situation where they are going to have the one attacked first so that they don't just lose their creature on the spot, right? And then I can do the awful thing that I don't want them to do to me, right? I can blow them out in response. So always be looking for opportunities to set your opponent up like that, and always be looking for spots where you can do something else instead of needing to act first. There's definitely spots where your back's against the wall, you have to be the first one to act. I totally respect that, and that's going to happen. You might get blown out those times, but those games are losing games anyway, so you have to take that risk, right? But if you're just at a parity game, don't put yourself in that position if you can help it. All right, the next big mistake I want to talk about, and I see quite often, honestly, I'm shocked how often I see this, is failing to plan out your turn. So for me, a player that's been playing a long time, it's second nature at this point. I take my draw step, I figure out what I want to do, I figure out the sequencing of how I want to cast my spells. But so often I just see players just, going to combat and attacking, and then I'll see what happens, and then maybe I'll cast a creature after combat, or maybe I'll cast a combat trick. I don't know. I'll just kind of go with the flow, But there's a lot of value to be gained just by having just a fundamental, simple plan, really. Especially when there's a card like Priest of Ancient Lore involved, or anything that'll have you draw additional cards. If that's the card you're going to choose to play, or you say, hey, this is going to probably be part of my turn, always cast the card that draws you a new card first, because that gives you more options. Because, how many times have you gone, cast my 2-drop, cast my Priest of Ancient Lore, oops, I drew a 2-drop that I want to play instead of that other 2-drop, right? That just happens so often when you're first playing with these kind of cards. So, Prophetic Prism, that's another one where you're going to want to cast that. If you know you want to cast that in that turn, cast that as the first thing. It'll just set you up for success. I think another place where this comes up is you have a combat trick in hand, right? And you go, okay, well, I've got a 2/2, they've got a 2/2, I kind of want my 2/2 to stay alive, and if they block, I've got a combat trick, it's all good. So you go to attacks, they block, and you go, okay, well, I use my combat trick here, that's fine. But then you realize, well, because I had to use that combat trick, I can't play my 4-drop anymore. And it would have been much better if I just didn't attack, and I've had my 4/4 in play instead, my 4-mana card. So just ask yourself what you want to accomplish in that turn. Or maybe, if you have a rudimentary plan, think about what the turn is going to look like after it's done, right? The end of turn. How do you envision the board? Well, would it be a better world if, again, you're 2/2/1 combat and you spend 2 mana instead of 4 mana? Or is it better if that 4/4 is just in play? Sometimes it's even worse, right? Where you're attacking your 2/2 into their 3/3 and you've got like a +2/+2 combat trick. And, you know, sometimes it's like, okay, well, you realize mid-turn, it's like, okay, well, I don't actually want to use this trick. And I do want to play my 4 mana card, so I won't actually use my combat trick. Our 2/2s can trade. But if it is that situation where you've got a 2/2 and they've got a 3/3, and you're like, uh-oh, I didn't know they'd actually block. Well, now I have to use my trick. Uh-oh, that really sucks. And now I can't have a good turn. So it doesn't take too long, honestly. I think it takes, honestly, if you just take a 15-second pause, 10-second pause even, just ask how you want this turn to go. What are your general goals? Are you trying to be aggressive? Are you trying to be defensive? I think often, especially in the digital age of Magic, and I've talked about this many times. I've even talked about it in the last Gameplay Mistakes episode. Players, including myself, I fall victim to this so much, is just they don't take a split second. They don't take an additional second just to think. Or they don't take that 10 seconds in the first place to plan out the turn. And if you just do that, you'll build good habits, and you will win a lot more because you actually have a plan. And that's so key to winning. I promise you, if you do this, you will win more. Sometimes when you're unsure of what that plan should be, or, you know, how you want to best carry out your goal of be aggressive or defend, it can be kind of daunting if you've got a lot of options. So I've actually got a tweet here from the one and only Lord Tupperware, Ethan Sachs. He had a thread of ways to get better at gameplay. And go check that out on his Twitter. But one of the ones I pulled here was, think of extremes. If you're having trouble figuring out what you want to do or how best to navigate a combat, think, what's the most aggressive line I can take? Or what's the most defensive line I can take? And then work backwards from there. So say you know you want to be aggressive, right? Well, what's the absolute most aggressive line? Attack with everything. I could use my combat trick if I wanted to, right? But then you realize, just like I was just talking about in that previous situation, okay, I don't actually want to use my combat trick because then I can't play my 4/4. So what if I just attack with my flyer? Okay, that's a little bit better. I still get in damage, but I can still develop my board. I still have all my mana, right? What's the most defensive line? Say you're on the back foot, right? Say this is a different situation. You are on the back foot, but you still want to be getting in some chip damage. So the most defensive line absolutely is not attack with anything, right? But you still want to make some progress in the game. You still want to be trading damage. Okay. Again, the solution might be, I just get in with my flyer, I block with my other things. If you start in these extremes, you can then notch it up or notch it back just a little bit until you get to the line you like, right? And this can be as easy as attack with 1 creature, attack with 2 creatures, attack with 3 creatures. That'll really help just your turn navigation, especially combat navigation. I find this helps quite a bit. All right, next up, a really tough one to get right. And this is, I think, one of the more common missteps that people make, is failing to switch gears in a game, or maybe even failing to identify when they should switch gears. So I'm, of course, talking about variants of who's the beatdown and figuring out what your role is, when you should switch roles. And I'm not usually talking about, well, I was the aggressor, now I'm the full control, right? Or vice versa. I was the full control, now I'm the full aggressor. Those don't happen very often, but there's definitely gradients of, okay, well, I can start attacking a little more here. I was getting beaten down, but now's my time to start attacking. Or the opposite, where I was the beatdown, but something has fundamentally changed about the game. And that's the core. That's the key of this, is there's a lot of times in games where something fundamentally has changed about them, and the player doesn't realize it at the time. And they realize a turn too late. And a turn is all the difference in the world. I can't remember who said this, but might have been LSV, it might have been on an episode of Limited Resources or something, but I remember this really stuck with me. And they said, the difference between a great player and a good player when it comes to this is the great player knows on the turn that they're supposed to switch gears, not 2 turns or even 1 turn later. The kind of more middling player, they'll notice, oh, the game's kind of slowed down. I guess I should start attacking. Or, oh, hold on, I was attacking, but that's not going to work anymore for whatever reason. So some common places that gear switching needs to happen. So if you're the aggressor and your opponent plays a big stabilizer, say a Hill Giant Herd Gorger, they gain 3 and they have a gigantic blocker. Well, maybe you were doing combat math in the previous turn, or maybe you weren't even doing combat math, you were just going attack, attack, attack. And you realize, okay, well, they played 1 more creature, and then you didn't account for the fact that they've gone up 3 life too, but you're still attacking. And you get into a situation where it's like, well, I guess I should just keep attacking. Maybe you're in a bit of a sunk cost fallacy mindset as well, where it's like, well, I was attacking those previous turns. I can't stop attacking now. Well, you definitely should, right? You just kind of want to chill a little bit. Or it's a situation where your opponent has played a life linker, and you don't realize that, okay, well, trades will happen. Maybe I'll get some damage through, but that life linker changes the math a little bit, and I need to maybe chill out for a turn, maybe not attack with everything. Maybe you're an aggressive versus an aggressive matchup. Your opponent and you are kind of, at parity. You've kind of been trading blows, sort of maybe almost ships in the night. You're attacking them, they're attacking you, and things are going, in your favor for the most part, I would say. And then your opponent plays a Warriors of Tiamat, and you don't have a blocker, right? It's the 5-mana 4/2 haste double team. And you've taken an additional 4 hasty damage, and then they're going to do that the same thing again next turn. And if you don't realize that changes the core conceit of what's happening in the game, where you were kind of trading at an even pace, you play a creature, you attack, your opponent plays a creature, attack, yada yada. If you don't realize that 4 damage made all the difference, and 4 more next turn, you keep attacking them, and maybe you lose, you leave one thing back, that can be the difference. I think most commonly where this comes up is not knowing when to turn the corner as the deck that wasn't initially beating down. It's very scary to, after getting down to 8 life and finally stabilizing, saying, okay, I'm going to attack this turn, right? And you have to be really careful because, definitely when I was kind of feeling out the waters in this department, I know I had, once in a while attacked with, attacked a turn 2 early than I should have, and then 1 removal spell. I was stable, but then 1 removal spell got a key blocker out of the way, and I was like, maybe I shouldn't have attacked that earlier turn. You kind of have to feel this out a little bit. It's definitely something that takes a little bit of practice, but I would say most players do lean towards not attacking as soon as they should when they have stabilized. As soon as you've got, you can account for your opponent playing a removal spell on a key blocker. Can you afford that to happen? You attack with your Hillgiant Herdgorger and they kill your next biggest thing. Is that going to be devastating for you? If not, you still have good blocks, then you should definitely attack with the Herdgorger. Another key moment can be your opponent playing a card that represents a lot of card advantage. Or maybe it's a bomb. Like, for example, your opponent plays a Skullport Merchant in a game that was, kind of parity-ish. You were kind of waiting to just draw some action. You could have made some attacks. You could have used your removal spells, but you were kind of holding them. When your opponent plays a Skullport Merchant, that game is going to be blown wide open on the card advantage front. And if that game is about card advantage at that point, it probably is because you're at parity, damage isn't going through. If you don't have any way to keep up on card advantage, you need to start turning the corner. You need to shift from, I've got to start attacking my opponent. Maybe they played a bomb. Maybe it's a card advantage accruing bomb of some sort, right? It's the same kind of thing where if they've got something where they're going to be advantaged in the long game, you got to start attacking them. So let's break it down here. Here's some fundamental gameplay changing moments. If you were attacking, you got to ask yourself, well, when should I stop attacking? Did my opponent gain a bunch of life? Did they play something that's stabilized? Did they play a lifelinker? Those are the big ones, really. Then that's when you have to stop attacking. Have they played maybe just enough blockers that I can't keep attacking all because too many of my creatures are going to get eaten, right? Where if I keep, I've been attacking, if I attack again, 3 of my creatures get eaten, I'm left with 2. What's my plan for the turn after that? If I don't have any burn in my deck, then what am I doing here? If instead, you were on the defense for most of the game, you've just stabilized, be very, very aware of when you should start turning the corner, right? It's like, until you're sure the answer is no, I would just do it, actually. Like if you would all have an inkling, you're like, I can start doing it now, go for it. The very worst that can happen is you learn from your mistake and go, yeah, that wasn't the right time to do it, now I know for next time. Again, I think most players lean towards not turning the corner quick enough rather than the opposite. And once you start playing in that space, you kind of get more comfortable with it. You kind of start to understand when you can push and when you can't. But if you never start playing in that space, you're never going to learn about it. All right, the next big mistake I want to talk about here is valuing the wrong resource. So I did an episode a while back about Magic's 3 core resources, and that's cards, life total, and mana. And I would say most games are about one of those things. Maybe they're about 2. But it's very rare that they're at a given point in the game about all three of those things. Usually one resource is more important than another. You know, you really care about your life total against an aggressive deck, right? The game's kind of gone down to a grind, so you don't want to give up your game pieces. You don't want to be chumping. You want to be making sure you're making good exchanges throughout, throughout your turns. And, it can definitely oscillate between being about cards, being about life total. Really depends on the game state. But the most important thing is in a given turn, when you're trying to figure out what you're trying to accomplish, I was talking about trying to figure out your plan, figure out what that most important resource is. So I have an example here in front of me. I was facing an opponent that had, a bunch of creatures. They had like 5, 6, 7 creatures on board. They had a flyer pecking in. I had about the same number of creatures, so it was pretty much a board stall. And I attacked with a Hill Giant Herdgorger, a 7/6. And they chose to chump at 24 life. They chumped with a Steadfast Unicorn. And I kind of went, that's really strange. And I actually knew all the cards in their hand too. There wasn't any like hidden information that I was like, oh, that's a weird play, but maybe something in their hand makes it make sense. I think they were just a little bit scared, honestly, about losing 7 life. And I would say this is a mistake to chump at 24. I would just say, you never know when you're going to draw a card that will help you double block this Herdgorger. Or maybe they should even just have double blocked in the first place. They actually had their own Herdgorger of their own. It was a 5/6 because I shrunk it with Hypnotic Pattern. But I just think that at this point of the game, at least how I was evaluating it, this game was not about life total necessarily. And, eventually every game becomes about life total, but this is about board position. This is about cards. This is about making good exchanges with your cards here. So, big picture here, don't chump when you're at an early life total, even if you're going to take a pretty big hit of damage, because if you chump, that's just one less game piece you have to work with to get yourself out of that situation that, made you want to chump in the first place. That 7/6, instead of chump blocking, well, you could just try to block it and get that thing off the table. So that's chumping too early. But we've got kind of the opposite end of the spectrum here. I've got another tweet from another very smart Magic player, Henry Mildenstein, who's actually been on the podcast before. There was a conversation on Twitter about how constructed players are very bad at attacking and blocking, very bad at combat and figuring out how to best navigate combat for their given game. And Henry's point was actually kind of interesting. He was saying even limited players, he doesn't think navigate combat very well. And his point was, he thinks that people don't chump block enough when life is the most important resource. So I'm going to read out his quote here. He said, I think attacking and blocking is viewed too much as a question of value. As in, do I win to trade off these creatures? Can I get value out of this block? Well, I think it's often a question of evaluating how important is the life total difference, right? Especially when the rules aren't established. He also says, and I think this is very true, that people don't have a good grasp of what life is worth. And most patterns of mistake he sees have to do with wrong evaluations of how much damage you can take in a turn, or how you should prioritize taking damage over other forms of value that you could have, or other resources you could be using, right? So really what Henry's saying here is, when you are low on life, it's okay to chump. It's okay to block with your value creature. And a point where this really comes up is, you're down to 7 life or something. Your opponent's pressuring you, and you've drawn a Soldier of the Watch for the turn, right? The 2/1 double team creature. And a lot of times I'll see people when they really should just trade off their Soldier that they just drew. They're like, no, I gotta get value out of this. I gotta get value. This is a valuing the long resource, and people want to get all the cards out of their cards, or all the value worth out of their cards. If a card represents multiple cards down the line, it feels really bad to not get that full value, right? And that does happen a lot. And this is, I think, a progression of people early on overvalue their life total. Then in the middle of their Magic career, they undervalue it a little bit, and they realize, oh, cards are the real important important thing in Limited, right? Or just in Magic in general. I really have to make sure I'm not spewing value on my cards. And then they realize, oh, it's about a balance, right? It's about chumping and throwing away a card when I need to, versus when is the game actually about card advantage? I need to get every last little, squeeze all the juice out of my card. Another place this really comes up is against the Hourglass Coven, right? The giant, 6 mana bomb, 4 black, 3/3 makes 2 more warlocks that the original one pumps. Too often I see people when they're low on life, they just don't block with their Hourglass Coven, or the thing that the witches that will give value, because they're like, oh, I really want to get to my upkeep so I can get a scry in, or I really want to get a 1/1. And sometimes that's right to do, but a lot of games that I've won against the Hourglass Coven are because my opponent were just afraid to block, right? They just didn't want to block with it because they're like, I can't block with my value creature. When so much of the time, the reason that card is good is because it gives you 3 bodies so you can stabilize yourself immediately. It's not about a value thing. It's about how much is your life total worth in that moment. And when it's low, and especially when you have other cards in hand you could be casting, consider chumping a little bit earlier than you normally would. Or sometimes not even chump. Make bad trades, right? Trade off your Hourglass Coven, again, that has some potential value down the line, for just a random 3/3 that's attacking you. Because that's what's important in that moment. And again, if I'm to overgeneralize the Magic player base here for a second, I do think that most players are biased towards trying to extract every small piece of value out of their card and do undervalue their resource as a life total at some point. Because, the way I always put it is, if your life total is high, if you can keep up your life total, then eventually you'll draw more cards, right? What's the best value in the world is staying alive 5 more turns, so you get 5 more draw steps, right? So really, really do consider your life total as a resource, both to spend early when you can, and later as, well, I gotta preserve my life total, even if it means spewing a bit of value on multiple cards here, making a bad double block, or a block that looks like a bad double block, because I do stay alive. All right, and moving on to another big mistake that I think manifests itself in a lot of ways is being an impatient player. So patience, I think, is such a learned skill in Magic. I think a lot of being an impatient player comes from the feeling that you always have to be doing something, right? If I'm not doing something, I'm not progressing the game forward, and then my opponent's just going to win somehow, right? They're going to top deck a good card. I got to push towards ending the game. And I think that's a very valuable thing to have in mind. I think you should have that in mind. I'm not trying to discourage that. But I also think that there is a time and place for patience. In a lot of games that I've seen players lose, or heck, I've won that I don't think I should have won, is because the player that I was facing, or the player that lost the game, did get a little impatient. And this may be, one of the ways it manifests is what I was talking about earlier with blinking first, playing your spells, or putting yourself in a position where you have to act first rather than your opponent. But there's a few other ways that it manifests that I want to talk about. One is when you're the aggressor and things are starting to look bad for you, right? Your opponent's starting to stabilize, and maybe you've got them down to a pretty low life total. You've got them down to 3, and boards are kind of even, and you've got okay attacks, but some of your things are going to get eaten in the process. Maybe you deal them, maybe you put them to 1 even with a big attack of everything. You've got no cards in hand. And I think the natural instinct is, well, it's not getting better from here. I guess I should just attack, right? And I just don't think that's true for the most part. I think if you just get that line of thought, or that, that phrase out of your head, it's not getting better from here, you're going to win a lot more often. I say this because when I'm streaming, chat says that a lot to me. Well, it's not getting better from here, so you should probably just attack all, right? And I go, no, it can get better. Like, I've got combat tricks. I've got, of course, if you got burn spells in your deck, that's a big thing where it's just like, yeah, now the game becomes, I just want to block and not die and then draw a burn spell. It happens quite a bit. But maybe it's you have a trample combat trick, or you have something that pumps your team, or you're just hoping that your opponent gets impatient and they start turning the corner or turn sooner than they should, right? I think that so many more games are lost by somebody getting impatient and just attacking and going, sure, like, I'll just attack all and see what happens, rather than the opponent outdraws you because you waited a little bit. Even in the situation, limited, like, this comes up all the time. When we're at parity, I've almost pushed across the finish line, and I just have to hope maybe I don't even have that trample combat trick or that burn spell in my deck. But my way of winning this game is not attacking all and having them eat all my creatures, then I have nothing. It's, I hope I draw a few more extra creatures than my opponent does, and then I can go wide. I've lost a lot of games like that where I felt stable, and I just kept drawing lands, and then my opponent kept drawing gas, right? That happens so much of the time. Because what happens if you go, well, I'll just attack all, and you don't have a plan for after that, is then you don't have a board, and your opponent doesn't have to worry about you cracking them back, right? They then have a bunch of creatures, and then go, okay, well, now I can kill them very quickly, because they've only got a 1/1 now, because I got to eat all their creatures in that one combat, and I can, in 2 or 3 turns, kill them. Whereas before, if you just kept your board around, they couldn't do that. They'd have to consider, well, they have a good double block, and they can attack me back. You're giving yourself more time to draw those things you need to draw that I was mentioning. The burn spell, the combat trick, whatever it is, the removal spell. Giving your opponent some time to mess up even. That might be what it is. On screen here, I've got an example. This is a constructed example, but my opponent's playing a mono green deck, all right? And they're out of action. I'm playing a black-red mid-range deck. I'm at 3. They're attacking with a bunch of creatures that will put me to 2 or 1 damage here if I just make blocks with everything. But they get most of their creatures eaten. And they're a mono green deck, so it's not like they have burn spells. It's not like they have many hasty creatures. At least I don't think this build of mono green had hasty creatures. So I believe my opponent got a little too impatient here. And they just attacked and said, well, now or never, right? But again, I was empty-handed too. And if it just got to the situation where I drew a few more lands, my opponent drew a few more spells, I would have been in a very bad spot because they could have just gone around me and then made attacks that killed me over the course of a few turns. So, wrapping this all up, when you're in those spots that you feel like your opponent is stabilizing, I know it's tough. I know it's really tough. Just hold on. Don't throw away that board. Throwing away the board is exactly what the player that is defending wants you to do. Trust me. Unless you have a plan. Unless you do want to have a burn spell to draw. And this brings me to my next point, and I think it's really important to be comfortable with not doing anything when that's the appropriate thing to do. I think especially when there's such a push to, spend all your mana each turn. You hear people saying that all the time. Make sure you're spending your mana. That really applies to the early turns of the game, 100%. Where you're like, all right, I really want to be curving out here. I really want to be maximizing mana efficiency. But as the game goes on, and mana efficiency doesn't matter that much, or doesn't matter as much, where you feel like no matter what you draw the next turn, you'll be able to cast your spells if you want to, it then shifts to, well, I instead should use my spell at a more appropriate time, or a time I think is the most appropriate, the most useful to use them. I think where this most comes up is using your removal spells too early. I think very often what will happen is your opponent will play just maybe a 3-1 on turn 2, and you don't have, maybe you have a 2-drop, and you trade that off, let's say, with their creature, and then they play a 3-mana creature, and you don't have a 3-mana creature, and you see a Sewer Plague in your hand, and you go, well, I know I should use all my mana early, but that creature's not that problematic, though, that they've played. Maybe it's just like a Celestial Unicorn, right? It's not that scary. Maybe it'll attack you for 3. But ask yourself, does my 4-drop blank their Unicorn, right? Or do I have cards in hand that'll stabilize me later? And if you do, if your 4 and your 5-drop stabilize you, don't absolutely feel the pressure to use your removal spells. Because removal spells are precious, right? You only have so many of them. And I'm sure you've experienced the situation where it's like, well, I used my removal spell early, and then my opponent played a bomb, and I couldn't answer it, right? Especially, I think, in Baldur's Gate, there are quite a few bombs that you demand a removal spell, and I'll try my very best to answer a creature with a creature, if I can, right? Use my own creatures as removal spells. Now, this changes. A few things can make this, make me think about this differently. One, if I don't think my next turn will stabilize me, cast the removal spell 100%. Or if your late game is so good and you have like a good 7 or 6-drop, maybe a Mythic Dragon, that you just don't want to be taking damage early, then yeah, for sure, just like keep pace with your opponent. Use that life total. You'll value your life total as that resource of if my life total stays high, the game will go longer, right? But again, I think this is a situation where more often than not, people lean towards using a removal spell a bit too early rather than holding it, thinking, hey, maybe I don't have to use this card right now. Maybe I'm okay spending this turn doing nothing because my next turn, I can just blank their creature and it'll be okay. And this is especially true because usually with my removal spells, again, my few removal spells I have in my deck, I'll want to use them for more than just a 1-for-1 removal spell, right? More than just my creature kills your creature. Sure, my creature kills your creature is a good exchange when they play a 6-drop or a bomb. You got to kill that thing. But what I'm talking about is I don't really want to use my Sewer Plague until my opponent casts a trick, because then I'm really getting leverage out of that Sewer Plague. Or to blow it in an adventure, right? They do cast a Blessed Hippogriff instant to make it indestructible, and you Sewer Plague in response, right? And that's the kind of thing that wins games in Magic. It's not just 1-for-1 exchanges. It's about setting up situations where your cards favorably line up against your opponent's cards. And I think that's kind of been a theme of today, right? Just engineering situations where you're getting value out of your card that isn't just what's written on the card, right? It's waiting a little bit to use it at a key moment. It's figuring out when is the best opportunity to use this card, not just, hey, I'm firing it off at the earliest possible convenience. All right, and moving us to one of the last big picture mistakes that I see is lazy playing. And this is, again, kind of an umbrella term that manifests itself in a lot of ways, but I think you can be lazy in a lot of ways. One of the most common ones is thinking in generalities and not thinking about specifics. So where this comes up a lot is you kind of say to yourself, well, I look like I kind of have a pretty good attack here, and you make the attack, and then you realize, oops, that wasn't a great attack because I thought I was going to kill them here, but I put them to 1, right? You kind of look at the board as kind of an abstract thing and don't actually look at the minutia and look at the actual interactions between what's going to happen when I attack and my opponent lines up blocks here. It's lazy, right? It's just lazy thinking. Another thing is, you know your opponent could have a trick, right? They're kind of representing a trick. And you don't think of exactly what it is. Or you don't try to think of exactly what it is. You just say, huh, it's a trick. Or, it's an instant. Just think about it. Like I said, it's not going to be that many things it could be. And it doesn't hurt to take 5 seconds, right? If you need to, look on Scryfall. Or G-Guards has a really great website called MTG Primer. You can just look and it'll tell you the instance for a certain mana value. Great resources to go to. And again, it doesn't take that long. It just takes a little quick alt tab out of MTG Arena. If you're thinking not lazily about these situations, you've recognized, hey, something's up, or you recognize, hey, I think we should start attacking, go that extra step. Just think, what actually happens? What could they actually have? Think about the specifics. So it's really, I'm advocating for a shift from general thinking to specific thinking, because a lot of the things I've talked about today, sometimes you don't even know the generalities, right? And maybe you've learned something today that you didn't think, you hadn't thought of before, or a concept, right? And then once you start to learn these concepts, and you're like, oh, I'm a more seasoned Magic player. I kind of know the ins and outs. I think it is very tempting to overgeneralize situations, right? And that can really get you into a lot of trouble. So the most, responsible thing to do is identify the general situation you're in, identify the general, hey, what's the approach for this situation, and then talk about the specifics, right? If you're leaving out specifics, you're leaving a lot on the table. I think another place this comes up, especially for those more seasoned Magic players, is relying on heuristics a little bit too often. Just, you've got a situation posed to you, and you think, well, how do I get out of this? And you say, well, the best thing to do in this situation is, use all my mana. Or the best thing to do in this situation is, X, Y, Z, whatever the heuristic dictates. But one of the key things I've been talking about today is using the information of the game to make a decision, not just some abstract Magic concept you learned, right? Using your prior knowledge plus the specific context of the game you're in, that's what comes in and helps you get to the correct decision for that situation. Use the heuristic as your generality, but then you've got to dial in. And I think a trap that people fall into a little too often is always relying on those heuristics. Because, 20% of the time, that's what a heuristic is. It's an 80-20. And 20% of the time, to give a rough number, you're going to be wrong if you just lean into that heuristic. Another example of lazy playing, I think, is doing what the cards ask you to do rather than what you need them to do. So, Magic cards, they have a home they belong in. They tell you to do something, and you get rewarded for them. Almost every card does this in some way or another, right? A very poignant example would be Soul Knife Spy, right? 2 and a blue, 3/2. When it deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, right? And you say to yourself, this card wants me to attack. And especially when you're not maybe paying the most attention to a game, or you're zoning out, or maybe you are using the heuristic of just like, well, this is what my card wants me to do, so I should do it. It's easy to misuse this card. Another example is a double team card, right? I was talking about not chumping with a double team card, even if you haven't got the double team value out of it yet. Sometimes people go, well, I know this card like really wants me to attack, so I'll attack with it, right? They're just defaulting to just a generality. And a lot of the time, the thing that you need the card to do isn't what it's asking you to do on the text box, right? You gotta block with your Soul Knife Spy sometimes. You gotta block with your Soldier of the Watch sometimes. A unicorn, right? A steadfast unicorn. You don't often want to block with that thing. You put it in your deck for the purpose of, it's gonna pump my team. But when they play a Hobgoblin Captain, a 3/1 on turn 2, maybe you're even on the draw, yeah, you block with your unicorn, because it's going to be a while till that unicorn is relevant, and that 3/1 is attacking you now. Again, like, this is the theme that keeps coming up. Really be in tune with your game. Figure out what you need to do to accomplish your goal in the game, and don't worry about anything else. If it feels right, just do it. It might be a good way of putting it. And one very last thing I want to leave everybody with today is the golden rule of gameplay. And the golden rule of gameplay is just every game is different. Every game is going to demand different things of you. Today, and any other content you listen to, I'm giving you a lot of guidelines. I'm giving you a lot of heuristics, right? I'm giving you a lot of, again, generalities, but there's going to be a lot of games that break these generalities. And I would say one of the pieces of advice that I often give to my coaching students is, as you become better as a Magic player, start to trust yourself a little bit more. Because so many times when I'm talking about, why did you do this in a game? Or why did you make this play? It'll come down to, well, I kind of felt like I should have done X, Y, Z, whatever it is. But I leaned back on the heuristic, or, just the generality that I heard, this content creator, this podcast talking about. And what I say to them is, you know what? I think you're a good enough Magic player that you should start to trust your gut a little more often, right? Just try to, when your subconscious is telling you, man, I feel like I should do this. Maybe you're not even sure why you should do the thing, but your subconscious remembered that a few turns ago, your opponent represented a trick, even if you don't remember that in the moment. And so, you don't go for that combat that you might have otherwise, right? The golden rule is just that every game is different and you should approach it as such. I would say even if you are more of a novice or more of an intermediate player, start to lean into your gut a little more often. I mean, maybe if you're a very, beginner player, learn the rules, play by the rules. But once you learn the rules, go off base a little bit when you feel like you should. At very worst, what will happen is you realize, oh, that wasn't a good idea because of this. And it'll become part of you as a player, right? If you never test the waters, you're never going to get better. Nobody made an omelet without cracking a few eggs and all of that, right? So it requires a bit of losing sometimes, but you're never going to break that barrier between fine player and great player if you don't try, or if you don't trust your gut once in a while and explore where those limits of gameplay are. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. Really appreciate it. Next week, not exactly sure what we're going to do. It might be the Lessons Learned from Baldur's Gate episode, but it's actually the 100th episode. I just realized next week. So maybe we'll do something special for that. A little bit of something that I haven't quite cooked up yet. But in any case, hope you enjoyed. As once again, if you really, really enjoyed and you want to support the show, check out that Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups, and we'll see you next time.